Okay, so let's take a look at what our content is for today, what we're going to cover in the next 2 hours. Discipline versus abuse. And if you recall at our last training, I think it included everybody, we talked about discipline and punishment. Okay, so discipline versus abuse, what are the differences there? Long-term effects of child abuse is where we're going to focus most of the time. Okay, and if right now you could think in your head the different types of abuse and what would be potentially long-term effects of each of those types. And then lastly, we'll be talking about prevention and community resources. And maybe some of you might have some thoughts and ideas about prevention and community resources. Okay, so let's first take a look at discipline versus abuse. And again, I'm just putting abuse up here, but I'm talking about child abuse specifically. So why don't I ask all of you, okay, what is the difference here? Just what comes to mind? Child abuse. It's intention to harm, right? Harming the child. Discipline, this is actually something that we promote and we want parents to, implement in their homes, setting boundaries and limits, positive parenting techniques, right? Discipline meaning to teach, right? To guide, and we know that's done in different forms, different parenting styles. We even talked about that. But overall, in terms of what the purpose is of these, the intent of the person can be very, very different. Child abuse demonstrates anger. The caregiver has power and involves humiliation, requires submission, no respect for the child here, and endangers, harms the child's development, which is in fact child abuse, endangers or harms the child's development, okay, in one or more areas, usually it's all areas. Whereas discipline demonstrates love and caring, teaches the child to make healthy choices. Again, we're setting limits for the child, putting rules in place. It does not involve humiliation or submission. Balance of punishment and respect. Okay. Now, sometimes, as we all know, we talk about discipline. There's different types of punishment, right, that can be implemented, and that's where sometimes they can kind of border and maybe go into the abuse category, particularly depending upon what state you're in, who's hearing about the incident. To use some examples, kind of current examples that I've been hearing about, is I've been seeing a lot more webcasts with parents putting their children on the internet, okay, as punishment for something they did, and sometimes recording it. I know there was one that the woman actually recorded herself giving the boy, what was it, hot sauce or something, and throwing him in the cold. And who knows what's set up, what's, you don't know that, but the thing is, again, it starts shifting over here, okay, and there's more and more professionals thinking, wait a minute, putting your child on the internet for the purpose of humiliation, shame, making them feel guilty for what they did is really kind of crossing the line, okay? And again, for the most part, when we talk about child abuse and some of these things, it's what the majority of people agree on is being harmful, particularly when it comes to emotional abuse, right? Because you can't, physically see it as a scar or a cut or a bruise, but what we know in terms of damaging their psychological state, yes. In fact, that's some of the long-term stuff we're going to talk about that is really most evident and sometimes minimized or overlooked. Okay. So just to mention that. Also, corporal punishment. Again, what do we say about the laws in the state of California regarding corporal punishment? Can you spank a child?
Yes.
Yes, you can. However, if you guys look on the internet, what you'll find is there's a great deal of professionals that feel that should be shifted over and to the other side. That violence begets violence, you're teaching aggression, that oftentimes parents are not in control. When they're doing that, it's typically out of anger, it's not controlled, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of Just so you know, there's a lot of controversy about that, but as of right now, legally, corporal punishment is allowed. Now, if there's a visible injury to the child, that's where it could be quantified as child abuse. Remember, we had mentioned that. Okay. So I just want to throw that out because, you know, particularly corporal punishment is a form of punishment. It's a consequence that some parents implement for particular behaviors. And again, you do want to implement consequences. We talked about that, you know, with parenting. And you also want to implement reinforcement, right? So you have both of those, and that's part of good discipline, but in a positive, caring way. Okay, so let's just look at some definitions, and some of this is sort of recapping from our earlier training, so we're clear on it. Any act or failure to act that presents or causes risk of serious harm. Okay, and you might think, well, serious harm being what? You know, how do you operationalize serious harm? Any act that endangers or impairs a child's physical or emotional well-being and development. Okay, and oftentimes it's that emotional well-being that, again, it's not as readily observable, but it definitely is very impactful there. Okay. Discipline, and just a few words about discipline. Again, meaning to teaching the child to learn right from wrong in a responsible, loving way. Process of teaching the child to know right from wrong. And goals being to raise well-adjusted children, okay, promoting strong social skills. You want the child to be able to make responsible decision-making, so you're allowing them opportunities to do that. Again, putting in place consequences as needed, praising as needed. And basically, you want the child overall to respect rules and order and other people, basically. Okay, so that's the purpose of that. Review of types of child abuse. So what are they? You guys know them all by now?
Physical, sexual, emotional.
And the largest one, the most highest percentage of kids,
Neglect.
over prevalence?
Neglect.
Neglect, yes. Okay, so just kind of a reminder of those four. And then keeping in mind, though, most typically children that are maltreated, it's not just one form that they're receiving, it's usually multiple. Okay, so sometimes even to do research and factor out which one affects which and what are the long-term outcomes, it's very convoluted. Okay? In fact, all of these impact the person's psyche. All of them have a psychological impact. Okay, so just a few notes that I wanted to make sure. At the core of every type of abuse is the psychological impact. Okay, that's across the board for all of them. Okay, and that which is not visible. Again, we talk about children's report of what's going on, if in fact they're verbal and able to report, but oftentimes we look for behavioral signs, right? Which we talked about that with our first training. Majority of maltreated children suffer from more than one type. Okay, we know that. Emotional abuse. Okay, and oftentimes people think verbal abuse, but it's not just verbal. That could be part of it, belittling and that sort of thing, putting down your child, but isolating your child, okay, certain types of punitive measures all have could have an emotional abuse factor to them. It's really intertwined with all of the abuses. Okay. And remember, I used the example of the case where the boy was put in his front lawn, had to wear the piggy suit and that sort of thing. But emotional abuse also involves when you have parents, there's been cases of parents actually that many of which were mentally ill, which is another factor we talked about as far as risk factors, but mixed messages of parents that parents get. So again, this is someone who's supposed to protect you and care for you, and there's been documented cases of parents that as they're hurting the child, they're saying things that are having to do with caring and warmth as they're hurting the child. So it's really causes a lot of confusion and emotional abuse that we don't see. There's been a lot of research on the possible long-term effects of child abuse and neglect. And I say possible. If you want to come in. I say possible because it doesn't mean that every single child who experiences this type of abuse is going to have this outcome. We know that's not the case, okay? So what we'll be talking about is likelihoods. There's a likelihood because we see in a majority of cases this happens, but there's different factors to consider about the particular incidents, and I'm going to go over what those factors are. It has to do with the second bullet. The effects vary depending upon the circumstances of the abuse, the personal characteristics of the child. Okay, there's some children that are more optimistic by nature, that are better communicators, that might be more intelligent, that have a better sense of humor, some other developed area that actually can be very good in terms of coping and dealing with the abuse. So we have to look at the personal characteristics of the child and also their environment. Some children are very isolated, where others, they may have another network, maybe at school, there's a mentor, they have a peer group. So at least there's something in place that may actually help them cope with it. It doesn't mean it's going to take it away necessarily, but could be in some ways a good way for them to cope and deal with it. So what are these factors? What kind of comes up again and again in the literature? Age is a factor. Frequency, duration of abuse, so how often it occurred, for what length of time it occurred, relationship to the abuser. As someone that you're closer to, when it's a parent, again, this is someone that's supposed to protect and love you. Okay, and they're the ones that are hurting you. Coping skills, okay, which again has a lot to do with the characteristics of the child and the environment. Okay, so if they have a teacher who's checking in with them, they have a peer group that they're interacting with, that can be helpful. So depending upon the factors, when we say that the effects, there's some variability with these, this is what we're talking about. Effects can be either short or long term. They can be mild or severe. So we do see some variation in terms of long-term effects, basically. So I want you to keep that in mind. Overall, what I want you to know about this first bullet, when we talk about the long-term effects, the younger the child is, the more impactful, so it's going to be likely they're going to have long-term effects from it. Okay? The more intense the abuse, the more frequent, the more chronic, so the longer the length of time, again, long-term effects likely we're going to have that. Okay? Relationship to the abuser. If it's someone who's very close to the person, okay, typically a parent, or also it's likely that you're going to see some of these long-term effects we're going to talk about. Depending upon the coping skills of the child and their personal characteristics. So some of this has to do with the word resilience. The more resilient the child is, they may not necessarily have the long-term effects of other children. Children that don't have necessarily the coping skills or just their character itself, they tend to maybe withdraw. They're not as gregarious or outgoing. That could be more of a problem. So those are some factors that we need to consider when looking at long-term effects. And then again, the environment, which really here it's talking more of the social environment. What resources are available for the child, at school, do they have other outlets and people that they interact with that actually are caring, that care about them, that could be mentors for them, that could help them actually deal with it. In fact, maybe even recognize and get them out of that, right? So keep that in mind again, so there's variability here. Now the consequences, in the research that's done on this, the consequences focus in on 4 domains. Physical domain, psychological, and behavioral. Okay? These top 3 being the ones that really have to do with the child, has to do with the individual. How the consequences affect them physically, psychologically, and behaviorally.